All right, let's get started here. So if you don't know who I am, this room is named after me, okay? So I'm George McCarthy, and the reason the room is named after me is because it's the burial ground for the brain cells that I gave up during the historic renovation of this house. It took us about 3 years to create this classroom. I don't know why the lights just went off. All right. It's an act of God, right? So, all right, so let's start. First, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. So today, we're on the unceded ancestral land of the Massachusetts, the original inhabitants of what is now known as Boston and Cambridge. We pay respect to indigenous people everywhere, recognize their wisdom and resilience, and honor this land which remains sacred. So thank you. So we're thrilled to have you here for the 2023 Journalists Forum on Innovations in Housing Affordability. We want to give great thanks to our partners, the TD Charitable Foundation and the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard, both of whom we've been delighted to work with over the last few years. For more than 20 years, the Journalists Forum has convened journalists around the country to discuss topics like land and water, the climate crisis, municipal fiscal health. This year, we're focusing on housing affordability, and you'll hear experts discuss everything from zoning reform to the impacts of cities' taxation systems on affordability to the role that financial regulation can play on reducing the homeownership gaps, or the racial homeownership gap. But you're journalists, which means you ask the why questions, right? So the biggest question you should have on your mind right now is, why do we host a journalist forum, right? Is it our preference to hang out with journalists for a couple of days? I have to tell you, journalists wouldn't even make the top 10 list of people I want to spend 2 days with, okay? So it can't be that, right? So, the official story is we host the forum to expose journalists to new ideas, policy innovations, and subject matter expertise, and to help you inform the public on complex issues that relate to land policy. But the real story is that we host these forums because we have a point of view, and because we have an angle that we think is unique, and we want to share that angle with you. And our point of view is really kind of represented in our tagline, which is we find answers in land. What does that mean? We think that land policy writ large is the fulcrum to answer other big kind of existential questions that face us as a society. Anything from how do we adapt to or mitigate the climate crisis to how do we preserve large habitats to protect endangered species. So for us, land policy is kind of the key to unlock the solutions to a lot of things that we all care about. But for us, finding the answers in land doesn't stop with our understanding of how land policy can address these insoluble challenges. That's where it begins. The rest of the story is, our work only makes a difference if we inspire others to act. And that if they act on the insights we provide, then we can begin the process of addressing some of these insoluble problems. And to do that, we need your help. My personal goal is to generate cognitive dissonance. And the reason I want to generate cognitive dissonance is because I want you to be puzzled. I want you to be puzzled, and I want you to leave here kind of trying to resolve kind of these dissonant kind of facts or these dissonant kinds of questions that we give you, because that's what's going to get you to learn and to think differently about how we can address some of these seemingly insoluble problems, right? So in the next two days, you're going to hear a lot of things about the different innovative ways we're addressing the housing affordability crisis. But I want to start with dissonance. I want to start with questions that kind of at least bother me, and hopefully I'm going to bother you. And if you remain bothered, that will be, I'll check that off as an accomplishment, all right? So one innovation that we're seeing now, one of the few times we've ever seen something happen at this level, is we're seeing state governments preempting local zoning as a way to address the affordable housing problem. That's really never happened before, and it really kind of challenges kind of long-held beliefs in the United States about local control of land use. Now, what does that mean? Well, part of preempting zoning is allowing people to do things that, as of right, that they couldn't do before. So many states now are allowing what we call soft density, right? Allowing people on single-family lots to add density by building an accessory dwelling unit. And, Accessory dwelling units sound kind of cute. In Arizona, where we have one of our offices, we call them casitas, right? But it's kind of a bigger question. Could soft density actually address the affordable housing challenge that we face in this country? And how would we know, right? So, let's look at the data. What is the shortfall of housing units in the country? And there's a debate about this, but if you go to Freddie Mac, they say that the shortage is 3.8 million units nationally. If you go to the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, they'll tell you it's 8 million units. And it just depends on how you look at it. The 8 million units for the National Low-Income Housing Coalition is 8 million short because there are so many people who can't afford housing. And if we add it up and across the markets, that's the shortage of affordable units. And for Freddie Mac, it's just a shortage of units based on what they estimate is the demand for new housing and what is the supply of new housing, right? But either way, so it doesn't matter. 8 million, that's a lot, right? It's a lot, especially because in an average year, we build about 1 million new units of housing. We build 1 million units of housing a year, but in the average year, we lose 2.6 million units of housing. That's just a little fact that you can kind of be confused about. All right, so how many ADUs have we built in the United States since, 2015? Do you think we've built more than 1 million ADUs since 2015? No, we haven't. We've built, so the estimates from Census are we built 772,000 ADUs. And then we built about 152,000 of them in 2022. So it's been accelerating, the production of ADUs. But that's about, if you listen to the Low-Income Housing Coalition, that's about 10% of the affordable housing that we need. And it's also, as it turns out, about 10% of the total production of new housing that we have in a given year. So ADUs are doing about 10% of the work of filling our housing shortfall, right? But think about it a different way. There's about 86 million single-family detached homes in the United States. So if we added one ADU for every 10 single-family detached homes, we built 8.6 million units of housing, which would more than cover the need based on the National Low-Income Housing Coalition's number, right? So that seems pretty promising. Then why are we only building, 150,000 a year, right? What would it take to actually solve the affordable housing crisis by building more ADUs? And how would we do it? How would land policy play that role? Because certainly the states coming in and saying, as of right, you can build an ADU is necessary, probably, to get ADUs built at scale, but it's certainly not sufficient. Because we've had the ability to build ADUs in lots of places, and we've built a decent amount. We haven't built enough. So what are the obstacles, right? Well, there's price. But we have a manufactured housing industry that can produce housing now at half the cost of site-built housing already. And by the way, that manufactured housing industry is working at about 25% of its capacity, because in 1999, they're citing about 400,000 new units a year. Last year, they were citing about 100,000, right? So we have the capacity to produce them, right? But they're not being produced. Why not? Well, what about financing? And this is a big deal, because in order to build an ADU, you have to be able to get financing, because most people just don't happen to have $100,000 burning a hole in their pocket ready to build an ADU. And in order to do that, then you're either going to have to get new mortgage financing that will allow you to claim the value of the ADU to qualify for the mortgage, and or claim the revenue from the ADU to be able to qualify for the mortgage because your income isn't sufficient, right? But who has those kinds of lending products? Well, hopefully TD Bank is ready to answer that call. But who doesn't really have a product and a process to serve the ADU market? Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And why aren't we pushing them to do it? They're under government conservatorship, and we could just tell them they have to do it. But telling them they have to do it doesn't get that done, because you have to have others out there ready to originate the mortgages. But there hasn't really been a commitment to do that, right? Because if we really wanted to, we could almost solve this problem with one single solution, ADUs, right? So I want you to be confused by that, because it's just not permissive zoning. It's just not. And what it also kind of illustrates is the complexity of the housing markets, right? Because housing markets depend on a lot of things, right? They depend on local land use control, but they also depend on national finance markets. They depend on a production kind of industry that is going to actually make things happen. And ADUs won't be produced at scale until somebody really takes it on and really drives the efficiencies into that production market that we know can happen, because we've seen efficiencies driven into housing markets consistently since the Great Depression, right? Okay, so I want to give you some more dissonance, right? Because I'm going to tell you that housing markets, by their very nature, are dynamically unstable. And what does that mean, right? It means that a single price cannot clear a market that satisfies two different sources of demand. What are the sources of demand for housing? Well, certainly the demand for shelter. And the basic drivers of the demand for shelter are things like the income of households, right? But they're also an investment good. And we talk about the commoditization of housing and how investors are kind of coming in and changing the nature of the housing market. But the fundamentals that drive the investment market and the fundamentals that drive the shelter market are different. And what they're always going to do is they're going to create dissonance in the markets themselves. Because when housing is a good investment opportunity, it becomes less good as a shelter opportunity. And as investors find their way into the housing markets, they're going to be able to outbid families who need shelter. And it's been happening and happening and happening. And you're going to hear about it in the next couple of days, where we're going to start even mapping out where investors are going to buy up our single-family housing stock for a variety of reasons. Sometimes to convert it from owner occupancy to rental, but sometimes to just hold it off the market for naked speculation purposes. We've also seen that we allow a lot of things to be built in this country because today there's 15 million more housing units in the United States than there are households. But we say there's a shortage of 8 million or 3 million units of housing, but we have 15 million more units of housing than we have households, right? Which means there's a hell of a lot of vacant properties. And you know what happens in the housing market? As you go up, the price gradient in housing markets, vacancies go up. What does that mean? Well, it means that we're building more and more stuff that people don't necessarily want to live in. And if you walk down Brickell Ave in Miami, if you walk down Billionaires Row in New York, you know what that means. Because you walk by these high-rise buildings with 3 lights on. Because somebody owns those places, but they're not living in them, right? And they're remaining vacant. And so these 15 million extra housing units aren't available because they've been taken off the market for one reason or another. But we let that happen, right? And every new unit of housing that gets built, we let happen because we permit it. And so we've been permitting them to build $100 million condos in New York, even though we admit that there's hundreds of thousands of units of housing that are needed, but not in the 100 million price point, more at the 1 million or half a million price point where people can actually afford to live in them. So if we agree that housing markets are dynamically unstable, what do we do about it? Well, you know another market that's dynamically unstable? The agricultural markets. And this was figured out by economists in the 1920s. And one of the things we decided in the United States is that the instability of agricultural markets can't be kind of condoned, because the implications of having unstable agricultural markets are that people starve when the markets underproduce. And markets will underproduce if they go unregulated. So what do? We create multi-billion-dollar agricultural bills to do what? To regulate the production of food. Taking land out of production when we're making too much food, bringing land into production when we need more food. The ag bill is one of the biggest, kind of debates in Congress every year. How many more billions we're going to put into the ag bill, right? So we regulate that market because we don't like the implications of people going without food. But we're not yet willing to regulate housing markets because we're willing to condone people going without shelter, right? And that's just a policy choice that we make. And it's also, we have to live with the implications of this dynamic instability, right? And if you want to think about those implications, I think about a housing bubble. Because when too much investment goes into housing and the cost of housing kind of outruns the ability to command shelter, what happens? The housing market collapses. And that's what it did in 2007 and 2008. Because all of a sudden, we had all this debt that we created to support the housing market and not enough income to support that debt. And so what do? We collapsed the entire global credit system. Central banks around the world were sucking wind because we allowed our housing market to kind of create this dynamic instability. But now we're going to be talking about what's going on, and it's very different, right? Because it's not about people buying up houses with mortgages they can't afford. It's investors coming in and buying up houses to turn them into rentals and jack up the rents. But is it possible that that's going to create a different kind of housing bubble? And what if it does? What happens when investors buy up houses, jack up rents so high that people can't afford them, and people stop renting them? Well, we get the same outcome. We get abandonment, we get vacancies, right? And we get a collapse of credit markets because a lot of that is debt-driven. So we might want to think about that, and we might want to think about why it is that we want to do something about all these institutional investors coming into these markets and buying up the housing stock to the tune of 20 to 25% nationally, and in some neighborhoods, and you'll hear about it, 80% of the single-family housing transactions that are going on are a transfer of housing from owner-occupants to institutional investors. That's something that we might want to take seriously. Okay, so I'm going to keep throwing stuff at you through the next 2 days to create this dissonance, because these are the things that get us to really think a little bit differently about how the market works. But I'm going to shut up now, right? I'm just going to inject these things through the rest of the next couple of days. And I just want to tell you that we really appreciate you being here with us, and we hope that we can be a resource for you. And I know that we can be a resource for you, and I hope that you will turn to us as a resource when you need to. One of the things that you should know, and I know this already, and everything I've said is on the record, right? And everything that you say and everything that gets said in this room is on the record. So it can be freely quoted, and I stand by what I said. I'm not ashamed to create dissonance, and I've done it very many times in my life. And so with that, I am going to introduce our next speaker to provide another introduction. So Monté Foster is with us. Monté Foster is TD Bank's market president of retail banking for Connecticut, Western Massachusetts, and he used to be upstate New York, but I guess you gave up that territory to somebody else, right? And his bio, like all of our speakers, is in the resource gallery, which you have access to. You can click on it online, or you can use the QR code that's on I think it's on the agenda, on the back of the agenda, to find out. But Monté oversees all retail and small business banking operations and lending services in this region, mostly, I guess, New England. And he manages a dedicated team of around 800 bankers and nearly 100 retail banking outlets. But Monté is also kind of, he's a frequent flyer here in Massachusetts because he's a student of Northeastern University and apparently a fan of the Huskies, right? And one of the things you might not know is that we've had a very, very good longstanding relationship with Northeastern. We've brought on anywhere from 2 to 5 co-op students every year, and some of them come and never leave, because we don't let them go, right? Not because they want to stay, because we won't let them go because they're terrific, right? So Monté, please offer some welcomes, and the stage is yours. And thank you all for joining us.
Well, certainly thank you, Mac, for those kind words. It's a pleasure to be here with you this morning as we strive to create tangible innovations in housing affordability for all. Finding access to affordable housing is not a new issue in America. In fact, for the last 2 decades, we have seen issues around this challenge worsen and multiply. Maybe you're here today because you've helped to tell this important story and shed light on the growing need of affordable housing. Maybe you're here to learn more about land use and opportunities, or new ideas and ways we can build better and fairer access to housing here and across the country. But whatever the reason, I think we can all agree that access to affordable housing is a challenge we must approach together as one community. At TD, our corporate citizenship platform, known as the TD Ready Commitment, is anchored in 4 drivers of change to promote more sustainable and inclusive communities. First, supporting economic inclusion and financial security by boosting access to financial services that open doors for employment opportunities, entrepreneurship, home ownership, and financial education. Second, supporting the protection and restoration of our environment in a way that helps communities to thrive. Third, promoting that sense of belonging by providing communities the opportunity for people to come together to create those connected communities. And fourth, supporting equitable access to healthcare for all. We are at a crucial time in America, one that may come to represent an opportunity to help those in greatest need in our collective communities. Today, we can work together and create solutions. Today, we can begin to break down the barriers that keep our fellow citizens from being able to access what so many of us take for granted. TD is proud to be a part of these conversations, to be an active leader and contributor, and to help to realize a more equitable and inclusive tomorrow for all of the communities that we serve. So I do want to sincerely thank you for having us today. It's a pleasure to be a part of the dialogue. And Mac, with that, I'll turn things back over to you.
All right, so now it falls to me to introduce our keynote speaker. And our keynote speaker is also kind of a frequent flyer here with us, Arthur Jemison. I knew Arthur when he worked at the city of Detroit, and now he's working in the city of Boston, and I seem to run into him all the time. And one of the things you should know is that as a city, Boston is doing some of the most important work around addressing the affordable housing challenges. And as I told Arthur before, it bears more than its share of the affordable housing burden for the greater Boston area, because the greater Boston area has 101 jurisdictions that don't all carry their burden for provision of affordable housing, which is one of the reasons why we need people like, or things like the state of Massachusetts to come in and preempt local zoning, right? But Arthur's part of a team in the city of Boston that's really, really digging into this challenge, and he's going to tell you a lot about that. You can find Arthur's bio, of course, in our resource packet. So I won't try to dazzle you with the details of Arthur's life. But Arthur, it's great to see you again, and why don't you come up and share some of your wisdom with us? Yeah.
Good to see you. Great to see you. Right. So, of course, as a public official, well, good morning. My name's Arthur Jemison. I'm the Chief of Planning for the City of Boston, and I'm the Director of the Boston Planning and Development Agency. So it is, of course, as a public official for a long time, very scary to be in front of a series of really smart real estate journalists, but I decided to take the challenge. I'll talk more about how important what you do is, and how you've always shaped not just the days I have, but the weeks, years, and the policies we come up with, and how important the work you do is to all those things. So listen, I'm here to talk a little bit about affordability, obviously, and I'm happy to do it in front of not just your minds, but a few other brilliant minds. Ron Rakow, the former assessor of Boston, is here, and as is Nick Allen. In two places I worked for a long time and care very much about. Ron taught me everything I know about taxation in the 90s. And Nick, of course, along with Mayor Duggan, Chief CFO of Detroit, Jay Rising, who's going to be our waiter, are doing very exciting things in Detroit. So what I wanted to do was basically talk to you a little bit about, start in Boston, make a quick stop in Detroit, and then close, so I can make sure I can take some of your questions. But I think wanted to give you just an overall perspective and then talk about the way we're approaching our work in terms of addressing housing affordability. We see the housing crisis as a combination of a need for general supply being produced, and then it's also the second challenge is obviously creating more affordable housing. The challenge is always in creating more affordable housing. It is possible to develop large amounts of affordable housing, but having that affordable housing be located in proximity to jobs, employment centers, having it be in proximity to the other key elements of life, supermarkets, transportation, things that make life work. It's important to highlight that. It's not as much of an issue here in Boston, but it certainly was a major issue in Detroit, and I'll talk more about that as I get into it. Each city has its own tools and approaches to tackling the crisis. In Boston, we're taking an all-of-the-above approach, which I'm sure will sound familiar, and I'm going to list a series of the kinds of things that we're doing. Before I do that, though, I'd like to provide a little bit of Boston context, which, of course, Ron can make sure I get right if I get any part of it wrong. So what's important to understand about Boston and Massachusetts generally is in about 1981, there was something called Proposition 2.5 passed, which means that you can't raise income on your tax base more than 2.5% per year. And what that means is that there's a significant constraining factor that exists there. So what I think it's done in Massachusetts, and certainly this is what I've seen CFOs do, is there's either an approach of leaning into that and saying, I'm going to maximize my base and I'm going to get 2.5% of that base, And I'm also going to, because it's not subject to the same rules, get as much new growth each year as I can, because that new growth is what gives me flexibility to have more than just the 2.5%. Or they take a sort of, I don't want anything to change in my economy at all, because I managed to find a way to make 2.5% work. And so what ends up happening is that the signals that sends to the different communities of what to do is quite different. In Boston, there's always been okay, we need to be on the growth side of this because we need way more than 2.5% a year to make Boston great. So we're going to focus on growing in every way, affordable housing, market housing, all commercial use. So with that background, I do want to talk about some of the individual things we're doing. I think we perceive supply and land use to be very connected. The ability to produce significant amounts of housing in the sort of market sense is obviously controlled by supply or by land use. So we've taken an interesting approach to it. Mayor Menino, Mayor Walsh have historically taken an approach where, honestly, they just kind of, maybe to use a basketball term, they kind of throw their body into it, and they literally know every person who affects a real estate decision in the community. And frankly, that worked for a really long time. But when you have a zoning code like we do, which basically the experience of the zoning code I like to share with people is East Bostonians and Orient Heights, who are very organized right now and talking to me every day about how much they hate my plan to add ADUs to their community. They will say, Arthur, this neighborhood zoned single family. And I say, so when you walk out of your house, have you seen a single family house in your neighborhood? And they're all two families and public housing. So telling me that you don't want a condition that literally exists in your neighborhood today is a difficult pill for me to swallow as a leader who's dealing with a housing crisis. So we see a need to, in order to house the community that's coming to Boston, that's grown in Boston, that wants to stay in Boston, that we need to not just continue to do the kind of expression of empathy and presence that Marty Walsh and Mayor Menino did. We've also got to combine that with a level of as-of-right capacity and a level of as-of-right development that acknowledges the world that we're not only in, but the kind of growth that the city needs to have. So I think supply side work that we're doing is primarily in a couple of different areas. We are changing the rules in Boston, starting in the Mattapan neighborhood, through plans that are being taken to zoning that enable certain activities to be as of right. So in the Mattapan neighborhood, which is a fascinating neighborhood that once was sort of the root of the Jewish community in the city, and then became, along with many Irish sort of sub-districts, and is now the place in Boston where most African-American home ownership exists. We're taking an approach that says it is as of right for you to have an accessory dwelling unit. And we're doing it and starting it there, and then coupling it with incentives to allow people to have access to 0% or similar kinds of financing, because we think expanding the value of African-American owned homes in Boston is going to have not just an impact on those families' ability to kind of grow in a multi-generational way that we grow in Boston. It's also going to give us a chance to potentially increase the value of African-American stakes in the city and increase the value of what they hold, because as we know, we have a very significant wealth gap that's impacting us in a number of ways, and the ability to start there and have success is a first way that we're approaching it. A couple other things I'd want to talk about in terms of incentives, and this is where Ron has to kind of close his ears. So we're also pursuing an approach that where we're offering a very deep tax incentive. You may take your taxes from where they are as an office owner to 90% of where they would to 10 to 20% of where they'd be if that building was a residence. If you convert to a residential use. Gensler, local architecture firms, completed a survey of all the buildings in the financial district and the greater downtown that says there's about 60 great candidates for office to residential conversion. And on the basis of that, we managed to convince the assessor and our CFO that we think that maybe 10%, maybe 15% of those buildings could be and will likely be converted with this incentive. So let's take a chance and provide an incentive to enable that. We've got 6 very good candidates in the door already, and as things continue to change in the office market, we're expecting to see more. But it's another key incentive that we're providing. I would tell you, though, that maybe a joke among friends is, so we started talking to Harvard economists and others about, okay, we should be thinking carefully about maybe this program starting to take hold. Should we be expanding our incentives for production to more broadly? You know, we've got a situation where developers are out there trading developments like Mickey Mantle rookie cards and saying, you know, we have 23,000 units of approved housing through my very difficult BPDA board that are already approved. You know, developers are saying, I don't want to do 20% inclusionary development, but they're sitting on 5 projects that are at 12% inclusionary development, and they're not starting them. And they're saying, you know, I can't, the interest rates are tough, the other things are tough. So I think we're strongly considering additional taxable tax incentives. But what's interesting is all of our economists have come back and said, Arthur, if you made certain kinds of development as of right in Boston, you know, it would reduce everyone's equity investment, reduce everyone's cost. That's actually might be more powerful than taking away the money that Ron is carefully squirreled away for the city of Boston. So we are not only considering the tax abatement, but more importantly, we're launching a new initiative called Squares and Streets, where we're going to each of our transit-oriented districts and effectively calling for an upzoning of those neighborhoods. Now, as I mentioned, people in different neighborhoods of the city feel very connected to zoning, like they fought for the zoning in their 90s and in the 90s, and they want it to stay the same. But I think there is a growing recognition that there has to be a significant upzoning in and around transit to enable there to be more as of right mixed income housing developed. This is a crucial second incentive that a way that we're trying to change the way the market works. Again, the basic concept is 10-minute walkable neighborhoods that are around our squares. I kept trying to call it squares and corners because the other nomenclature for Boston is squares are the public ones and corners are where there's a strong business. So in my neighborhood, Fields Corner, the idea was there's a big shopping center. Is there any way to incent people to do it? But that's a second incentive on the supply side. What I then would like to do is talk about public land, public good. So the other thing we're trying to do as a city of Boston, and this is a familiar story for Detroiters, owns a lot of the city. At one time, it owned an enormous amount of the city, but now Boston is largely privately owned. We still have very significant land that we can introduce into the development market. So just last night at the BPDA board, we announced the developer is going to develop about 500 units. We approved their project on a set of parking lots that belong to us in the Charlestown neighborhood of the city. So putting significant parcels of land that are acting as parking lots or underutilized in other ways is another incentive that we can provide to help on the supply side. So what I'd like to talk next about would be to talk a little bit about the affordable housing production side, because affordable housing production is the other part of the work we're trying to do. Obviously, ARPA has been an incredible help to us. It's really transformed our ability to invest in affordable housing. We have a very significant number of units that are coming, but it's a little more, I think, interesting potentially for journalists and others to talk about the ways that sort of local acts are contributing to affordable housing production. Last week, our zoning commission passed our first inclusionary zoning. That's a development from our inclusionary development policy. We have an inclusionary development policy that requires, I think it started out requiring that 11% of all new market housing had to include it had to be affordable to incomes earning between 70 and 100% area median income. So over the years, that was raised slightly, and so one of the major objectives of the mayor was to increase that from roughly 15% mandatory to approximately 20%. 17 is just conventional inclusionary development, and there's a 3% allowance for voucher holders to be able to access units because often FMRs are a little bit lower than what someone could achieve in the broader market, but they're still having difficulty being placed. So this is not just an important policy from a making developers participate in producing affordable housing. It's also important because, especially in Boston, with our particular and unique heritage, creating neighborhoods where there's a wide range of populations and people able to live in them, and places where there's not just luxury housing, but there's a combination of luxury and affordable housing is not just a public good. It has a sort of specifically social impact. That is a policy that is a succeeding policy from something called linkage. When we grow office space, there's an exaction or tax that effectively is placed on each office building that creates new revenue or new capital, I should say, for housing production and goes to our neighborhood housing trust for allocation as part of our affordable housing system. So I think I've touched on just about all of our, with one exception, just about all of our incentives on the supply side and changes we're making, and I've also talked a little bit about the way that we are approaching our affordable housing work. What I wanted to do just to kind of bring us to a close here would be to talk about Detroit, Michigan. So I had the luxury of working for Mike Duggan as his housing director and as director of planning and as the kind of a group executive for planning housing development. I see Jay Rising, the current CFO from Detroit here. It's always great to see you, Jay. You're here with Nick, as I mentioned earlier. But the issue we have in Boston is I need to produce. In fact, I have a fun story about working with Deval Patrick as the Deputy Undersecretary for Housing in the teens, and creating a statewide housing production goal of 10,000 units a year. And then going to Detroit in 2014, where we had getting rid of 10,000 units a year, and it's funny. It was funny to Bostonians when I would tell them I'm working in a community we're taking down 200 houses a week, and people were just like, "Why would you do that?" Well, it's important because just to provide a contrast, since I know many of you are journalists, not just from the Boston area or New York or the East or West Coast, but some of you are also from the Midwest. Detroit has very different challenges, and the process of developing affordable housing in Detroit, when I arrived there, was very much, I would sort of joke about them kind of being like wildcat developers. They would find a location, because just about every part of Detroit is eligible for a range of benefits from the state and city and has eligibility for affordable housing. And they would do a new single-family development, sort of single-family-oriented development, kind of wherever they could get a hold of land. And so what we found was that we're spending millions of dollars of city money and state money on creating affordable housing that's going to be safe, clean, decent, stable, but it isn't it isn't mixed into the strong, well-populated parts of the city. So we began to develop with philanthropy and others a strategy called, at that point, targeted multifamily areas. So you can't build affordable housing wherever you want to. You have to build it near transit. You have to build it, all the same fundamentals that are true in a place like Boston. And then we're going to congregate all of our transportation, park, and all those other investments in a very small area so that there's affordable housing there. It's a key part of what happens, but it's there with a whole series of other investments, including market investments, because anyone who's been to Detroit now knows the kind of changes that have happened. Largely, and the massive amount of them are positive. One of them is you do go to a place like Island View in the Greater Villages and see a mixed income building with market and affordable housing, a new park, a new streetscape, all the different things in the same place. And that is, for a different kind of city at a different time, the real challenge of creating affordable housing. Because in a place where everything is affordable, how do you create places that people desire to be and that are close to transit, close to employment, that we can kind of grow Detroit together as opposed to just kind of, again, wildcat developments. So, I think I've talked about the things I wanted to make sure you knew about. But I think it's also important whenever I'm in front of journalists, as a person who's worked for 30 years in some version of the public sector, there's days that are shaped by the words you guys write. So I was going to highlight two. So listen, there's a Spotlight team which it's famous in Boston for focusing on important issues, issues at the Archdiocese with hiding some of the abuse that was going on. All kinds of stories, and I can remember them from being a kid growing up in Massachusetts. But they're focused on housing now, and I can't tell you how much the dialogue has changed and how much of the finger pointing that really needed to go on about the way that places outside Boston approach affordable and other kinds of housing production. It's made a big change. And so for the Detroit folks, I'll also highlight, Christine McDonald's reporting on overtaxation changed days, weeks, months of my life working there, but also raised really important issues that I think have really caused the new conversation that's happening now, the land value tax that Jay and everyone will talk about, to become part of the dialogue. And so just to highlight the journalism you're doing about development, about taxation, about housing policy is not just helpful, it helped me read it every day, but it also shapes the way we do our work. And so just a enthusiastic keep it going for each of you. Those are my comments. I'd love to answer any questions you have about anything we're doing now in Boston, or we got other folks who can help talk about Detroit. I can also talk about the federal level. I had a chance to work in the Biden administration for about 2 years as the acting assistant secretary of community planning and development, so I can talk about that too. But with permission, Anthony, another famous reporter who covered the growth of the 100 acres in South Boston. Any questions? Any way I can answer some questions?
Yes, please. Can we open it up? And I would just say, speak into a microphone. Of course, I'm not doing it. Sorry about that. But we'll pass around a microphone and just identify yourself and fire away. Ask a question. Diana, you look like you're looking for can our team. Here's one coming right now. Thank you so much, Caroline. By the way, the wireless network is, please go ahead to Diana Lind. It is welcome. The password is welcome to Lincoln. It should come up LILP guest. And the hashtag is hashtag JF23. Best we could come up with. Journalist Forum 23.
Thanks so much for your remarks. That was great. I was curious about the example you gave us, the Mattapan neighborhood, and what kind of outreach the city might be doing or others to talk with residents about ADUs and present it in a positive light. And the way that you were describing it was like expanding the value of their homes. I'm from Philadelphia, where a lot of people see ADUs as a way of overcrowding, not positive density in neighborhoods, parking problems, et cetera. So I'm curious to know how you're working with residents.
Sure. So I'm having both experiences at the same time. In the Orient Heights section of East Boston, which believes that it is a primarily single-family neighborhood and feels very encroached upon by development. The debate we're having is ADUs are not an enemy or a menace to your neighborhood. Now, in fairness to those residents, they have also seen another phenomenon we have. So when everything is sort of zoned down to, even being below what really exists, everything requires a zoning board of appeals change. So what they've seen historically is thousands and thousands of zoning board of appeals cases that have been decided, allowing another unit or something to be scraped and a new development to be built. So they have it's actually really eroded their faith in government. And it's real. I've seen the data, their experience really is connected to the data that we have. So in that neighborhood, working with electeds, we have, I think, been able to establish some trust that by making these changes and making it something as of right that's less than what's happening in these more wildcat scenarios, we've had success. In Mattapan, I think what's happened in Mattapan, it's a place that hasn't had a lot of new development proposed. And so the community's beginning to see some investment. People from South Dorchester who see values kind of being a little lower in Mattapan and would like to buy are saying they kind of perceive themselves as having a chance to kind of get ahead of a trend or a market and be able to participate in it. Mattapan has a lot of multi-generational families from the West Indies, Haiti, many other parts of the Caribbean live, and the idea of having a new a place for a grandparent or a relative to live and all the things that come with that, and also the chance to sort of take advantage potentially of equity that might be present in their home that hasn't been there for 20 or 30 years. They're seeing it differently maybe than the East Bostonians are, who see it as, they've already lived through a sort of torrent of unwanted development. So I think that the neighborhoods are in different places, and so we have a chance to sell both of them a product that we think is going to be helpful, but for different reasons and in different ways.
Thank you.
Hey,
How are you?
I'm Ben Christopher. I'm a reporter with Cal Matters, which is in California, so I'm not local. So I appreciate all the new information.
Local flavor and funny word names. Town.
Yeah, exactly. You got our prop 2.5. That's really fun. Right? So, just curious, some of the initiatives that you're talking about, particularly in the zoning side, ADUs and squares and streets, I think it was.
Yep.
In California, the sort of tension between state and local government is kind of top of mind in this debate. What's the role of the state in all this, either supporting or not the initiatives that you talked about?
So I'm going to get some of this wrong, but anyone from Massachusetts will probably get it right. So we've actually been a leader the states have been a leader in sort of using its legislative power to legislate to sort of create anti-snob zoning like 40B, where each community has to have a certain level of affordable housing in it, and if it dips below, it has to take an action to get back into compliance. So 40B developments, if your community hasn't met that 10% for a certain period of time, they become as of right, and so it sort of forces communities to sort of decide, okay, how am I going to comply? What kind of development do I want? What the communities that are on the ball. So that was something that state officials, people like me, loved, and people, whenever I go to a sort of Massachusetts community, as I had to do as a Deval Patrick administration official, hate it. But it's worked, and the question is like, should it be more stringent and require more, or it worked? So I would like, but there is something to highlight that's even newer. So in the Baker administration, there was a new thing called the MBTA Communities Law, where it said you have to turn, a property near your train station into it has to be zoned for housing. It has to be permittable and usable for housing. And you'd be shocked at how the level of resistance to those changes that you're hearing from Massachusetts community people saying, I'm not going to comply, I'm not going to do it. So there's a history of the state kind of getting it together and saying, you've got to do this, but there's also a lot of local pushback. But again, I think I really do think that as we look back 10 years from now, we will be saying that the MBTA Communities Law was a very big deal, the same way that 40B was, where the state's saying you have to do something about this. And you hear these crazy arguments like, well, the town dump, I know that it's next to the train, I know that nobody's using it, but like you can't possibly put housing there, and people are really they're really dead set against. I've got a great joke about this I'll use at the end, but Okay, I'll tell it now. So my I had the chance to work with some great old timers at the at DHCD, and one of them remain unnamed. She was one of these people who's like really astute, but you always catch her outside the building smoking. So I would talk to her, and she tell me these stories. Arthur, like I think I came back one day kind of really discouraged. One of my beats at that time was something called Gateway Cities. Springfield, Pittsfield, Holyoke, Chelsea, all the sort of smaller former industrial communities of the state. So I came back one of these days very discouraged from talking to them about one of these issues. I think it was, there was one city that really just made me so angry because the just refusal to build affordable housing was very intense. And she's like, Arthur, come on, man. These guys, so you're talking about a place where people would get up and leave, like in the 1600s, they'd get up and leave Boston because the Puritans weren't Puritan enough, and they'd go to a new town and name it something else and have a town meeting. And then, some of those towns grew up and they burned witches. So, like, you think they're really going to be excited about new housing? Like, I don't understand where the expectation comes from, that, like, why they would be. You're going to have to convince them. So anyway, I laughed really hard. I think I probably smoked one with her too. But that's like, that give you some of a description of what it's like and what the city-state relationship is. They kind of perceive, you're coming in here, you're trying to make me not spend 2.5% this year. You're trying to give me these school children. You're trying to, redevelop the town dump. And listen, I also know, like, they have their own reasons. I don't want to make it seem like they're a lot of them very sensible, have very good reasons for the opinions they have, but that's really the clash. And so creating an incentive for them is important. And it's a lot of great local leaders. I mean, I grew up in an affordable housing unit in one of those progressive towns that cared about this. So all the same energy that I sort of described humorously is also present in a progressive sense in many towns. So I don't want there to be a misapprehension. But like, we got to find a way to like lift up those people who are doing great stuff and talk about it all the time. And I'm not sure what it's like in California, but okay.
The witch trials sound pretty similar.
So I promised dissonance. So Arthur, I'm trying to work through kind of the economics of commercial to residential conversion. I'm wondering kind of how we confront some of these big issues, right? So for example, in Boston, the average commercial property was built with an expectation of somewhere between $80 and $100 a square foot annual rental, right? And when I talk to developers about the conversions, they're saying that the typical floor plate of a commercial building is so big, you can't really get a one-to-one conversion of usable commercial space to usable residential space. They're saying it could be as low as 60% on the commercial, right? So you look at just market rate housing in Boston, and then the market rate housing is going 25 to $30 a square foot, right? So you got to replace at 60% something that's bringing in $80 to $100 a square foot, or something that's going to bring in $25 to $30 a square foot. How are we going to convince anybody to do that? And then how are we going to convince Ron Rackow, right, that we're going to now charge the building that was paying commercial property tax rates, they can pay residential property tax rates, which are going to be also considerably lower. So it's like a lose-lose-lose proposition. And the only ones that are going to be winners are the people who are going to potentially be able to rent 60% of that space as residential.
So there are about 3 or 4 great questions in there. I'll also start with, the first thing was getting the assessor to agree that this was a good idea and that it wasn't going to happen so many times that we were going to destroy the Boston office market and tax base. That was number 1. So then number 2, we did a couple of focus groups with developers, and they said as soon as buildings start selling at $100 a foot, then people are going to love this. But until then, they're going to say like, I want you to give me more money. So they started to sell like that. And people are walking in the door and saying, I'd like to talk to you about this tax abatement. Now, the thing that all of them say is, and it's been really interesting to kind of get into the way they're thinking about this. It's like, so listen, office is bad, but it's not that bad. And so, what motivates them is not their current tenants, because they got the tenants, many of them have them locked up for a little bit, they're paying, even if they're not using the space, they're signed up to pay. What they're saying is, listen, my worry is that the next tenant is, this tenant's going to leave, my next tenancy will be smaller, for less money, with more incentive, and I may not get them. And I am competing with a bunch of like amazing new A space that just came on. And again, this is back kind of answering your third question. And so I've got this old building from like 1750 that was an amazing marvel in 1750, but now it's like small. So, and everyone wants to land market, and it's like, so there's a pitch to those folks and say, maybe you had a state or kind of government tenant for a long time. Maybe you have a low basis in it. It's going to sell like those other comps, and your bank told you that these comps are pushing your value way down. Talk to us. Come get a tax abatement from us. And then the state has done. I don't want to toot their horn for it, but they did a great job with the new bond bill, and there's money in there to help us with office to residential conversions. So I think you're right. And so the question for us is not how do we do 50 of these? It's like, how do we do 15 of these? Maybe starting with a few. And the way I said it to the audiences I had to say it was, if there was a sale on office buildings in downtown Boston, you can get them for this much and turn them into residential. They're right on top of train stations. Why would we not spend money on that? We should be spending money on that. And I hope that's what got us over the hump in terms of what we should, in terms of making a decision that we should look into it. But it did start with, honestly, the CFO and the assessor, because we pursued a very particular approach to taxation in Boston for a long time, and it's one of the reasons we're strong. And so I think I get why it took a long time to get here.
Okay. So is everything that you were talking about on the affordable housing side predicated on having inclusionary zoning? And what are things that work if you live in a state that doesn't allow that in locality?
So it doesn't allow that. Just want to make sure I'm keying in because I would say, got it. Yes, it's all predicated on an attitude towards inclusionary growth. Now, I'll give another fun example that Jay and Nick will enjoy. So in Detroit, we had this requirement that 20% of everything be affordable also. But it's because we had to spend money we had to do a tax abatement or have the council act on just about every market development anyway. And they're very concerned about any growth not being shared. And I think it's a fair concern given the history of the city. And so the argument became, we need to do 20% affordable because we're going to have to put money or tax abatement or some other skin in the game anyway. Let's create mixed income communities. I think in Boston, it's like developers are, who are doing 100% market buildings are doing great. They should, and there's a social value of having people live together. I think that the impulses came from different places, but yes, there was an attitude towards we need to do something to signal mixed income communities, and we need to do something to produce mixed income communities. There was a commitment to it of one kind or the other. So I wish I had a better answer. It's like finding a way to having people say like the growth has got to be shared in order for it to matter. And just between Boston and Detroit, communities very, very skeptical about development for their own localized reasons. There's something that everybody could agree on, that there needs to be affordable housing in the mix.
Rob Square from State Line. So there's a census data that said New England had kind of a huge shortage of aging-ready homes. And I know that aging advocates have kind of pointed to ADUs as a big solution to helping kind of that change demographic. How much input have you gotten from those aging advocates or local groups about that as a solution point in terms of AUs and will have a more outsized growth as those populations get older and need that housing?
So I appreciate the question. I have not had any inquiries from groups about, but I also haven't. I probably should have and should be engaging them more directly, especially because there is so much, for lack of a better word, overhousing in specifically sort of the greater Boston area, and I would think it would be a more appealing approach. But there's been great coverage in the Globe about like attitudes about ADUs, and the belief that it's like sneaking in more density. But I do think that those communities of people who are aging, who would like to age in a different way, are really a ripe territory for us to make our case. So I think it's a missed. I characterize it for us as a missed opportunity that we need to jump on.
Okay, how about two more? And then we've got to let Arthur go back to the business of helping run the city.
Gregory Scruggs with the Seattle Times. I've been puzzling over the role of the freeloader problem in affordable housing debates. And I'm curious how that informs, if at all, the politics here. So by way of comparison, in Seattle, our voters last week just approved a $970 million housing levy. I voted for it, 70% passage. Good for us, the most money that the city's ever allocated, the voters have ever allocated to affordable housing. The rest of the region, which is larger and more affluent, has not passed any levies. One of my colleagues has reported on homelessness spending. Seattle per capita, 6-1 more than the next most generous municipality. And at the outset, Mac was saying how the Boston is shouldering a disproportionate burden of the affordable housing crisis. So how do if at all, the question, the freeloader problem inform the politics? Is there any local backlash within Boston that we're actually doing too much, and until our neighbors pick up the slack, maybe we shouldn't be taken for a ride, as it were?
So yes, there is, and I would say, I would also, again, not to keep giving them a plug, but I think the Globe's doing a great job of talking about this issue regionally. But I would say, I'm not sure if it'll be a surprise, but like the place I hear about this the most is in the historically African-American communities of the city, specifically the Roxbury neighborhood, where they will say, as a result of urban renewal and a number of other things, that's really where a lot of the owned land of the city and its agencies and authorities exists. And so the strategy we talked about, public land for public good, we could do a lot of it in Roxbury. And so, newcomers, old timers will say, like, why are you're just putting every affordable housing development you can in my neighborhood, aren't you? And the answer is kind of like, yeah, because we can. And it's like, that's not a good answer. But it is also, but that's where some of the pushback is coming. Like, I need you to put home ownership in my neighborhood. I need you to put home ownership I can access in my neighborhood. I need you to put supermarkets and other things in my neighborhood. I love affordable housing. Many of the people who I know and love use and rely on affordable housing, but like, are we doing too much in our area and you're not getting it? And so again, I think I had this conversation actually with members of the Globe editorial board. We said, that's who's telling me they need you to do something in the suburbs are people who are saying, I would like my community to grow in a different way, and they've got a right to that. And I feel like that's not something that we've been able to deliver to them for a lot of reasons that are very historic. But it's something that's happening today. And so when they don't do their part, the pressure comes to places that don't always have the leverage to push back. And so it's a big issue. And so again, I don't think we talk about the freeloader problem, so to speak, very kind of broadly. But for me, that's a meeting or me or one of my team is doing every month with people who are saying, I get it, but like, why are you doing? Why can't you do this in another community in the region? And they're right.
Josh Stevens, California Planning Development Report. I'd like to bring you back to Detroit. Given the cost disparities between Boston and Detroit, or the West Coast and Detroit, how do you see the demographic migration patterns playing out there? Is there a case to be made that a family struggling to make rent in Boston should think about moving to Detroit and have lower cost of living? How do you see that playing out?
So it is playing out. It's playing out in Massachusetts. It's playing out in the things I was describing before, the gateway cities, the sort of smaller communities, the Brocktons, the Chelseas, et cetera. You can go to those places and you can buy a house that is going to be 70% of the cost in Boston. and not only that, they're also doing some of the same strategies we are, public land for public good and other things, and they're growing. And so, there's an article that I think I like, again, it's article, right? Article changed my day. There's an article saying, all these African-American families are leaving Boston and going to Brockton and buying a house. And it's true. And so the mini version of it that's happening already. And so listen, living in Brockton has different challenges than living in Boston. But you can buy a house in Brockton. And there's a history of African-American leadership and ownership in that community that people are gravitating to. And so it's a challenge that we have. And so I would tell anyone and everyone to explore living in Detroit. It's a great place to be. But I also think there's most people don't think about, I'm going to leave and go to a whole other region. But they're doing it on a smaller scale. And they're doing it here in the Commonwealth, and they're going to different communities. One other thing I might point out that Mike Duggan always used to point out to me about Detroit, because my parents are Detroiters, which is why I came back. But I miss the whole generation of fellow people in high school and everything in Detroit. And what they'll talk about is there was this moment where their parents they lived in Detroit, they focused on being in Detroit, but then there was a moment, and I think some of this was really accelerated by 2008. Mayor would always say, hey, white flight changed Detroit, but black flight really changed Detroit, because suddenly it was a little bit easier to move into the suburbs, and there was a sale on the suburbs in 2008, and so people said, I could probably do okay, if I didn't stay in it. So the sort of what's the business proposition? And the business proposition changed. I think some of that probably happened in Massachusetts too, where Randolph, which is a kind of a suburb of the city that's been particularly friendly to African-American in-migration, places like that are seeing very significant change. So the thing you're talking about is happening. I just think the place to look is more a local way, like it's happening in sort of as other markets soften. People were migrating to those places. But again, check out Detroit.
All right, Arthur Jemison, Director of the Boston Planning and Development Agency.